Well, not so long ago, coalition parties were singing the same tune, but it does seem there is indeed trouble in paradise already. Barely, nearly just under 2 years since signing cooperation agreements, cracks are starting to show in the IFP-DA coalition-led councils in KZN. Now, recently, DA-led groups in Nelson Mandela Bay saw the ousting of the DA's Athol Trollip, while Mayor Herman Mashaba seems safe for now in Gauteng. Now, Tshwane's mayor is facing a motion of no confidence. Let's see exactly what the opposition parties have been saying.
We are not part of the DA. We will not be forced to vote with the DA even when we are aggrieved. Let me tell you, there won't be such a thing in Joburg. If the DA wants to remove Mashaba, they must remove him. We will not remove Mashaba. For simple reason, Mashaba works very well with everyone. He consults, he makes his views very clear, he gets persuaded.
The fact that at Nelson Mandela Bay there is a misunderstanding between the partners there, it doesn't mean that the coalition must be written off in South Africa. So yes, in order to avoid a one-party dominance which breeds corruption, we must have government of national unity through coalitions.
Parties in their respective councils have spent more time discussing motions of no confidence than saving our people. We therefore believe that the final resolution that will restore order and sanity in all these municipalities is to have a fresh mandate so that the ANC can have a clear mandate. If the ANC does not get that particular mandate, will make way for those that have been given a clear mandate to run these municipalities.
So come tomorrow's council meeting, we will not be fielding a different candidate. The caucus in Tshwane is resolute. The Democratic Alliance and the Federal Executive is resolute on this matter. We stand united behind Solim Simanga, and we will not cave to the demands of the ANC and the EFF in their collaboration together in wanting to steal back the municipality.
So that's what the politicians say. Of course, we've been asking you to weigh in on this discussion. Do you think coalition governments are working in South Africa? As promised, we are joined now by researcher Paul Berkowitz, who's been writing extensively about all of this. And we thank you very much for your time this evening. I mean, broadly speaking, let's start with the ANC, since they are the governing party. They've characterized this era since the local government elections in 2016 as one, if I'm quoting them correctly, of unprincipled coalitions. But that really is their nature wherever you find them around the world.
Well, Bongani, I think we can agree that politicians will say certain things in certain situations. It's true that the ANC is the biggest party, has been probably in the greatest number of coalitions, and the party was in coalitions before 2016, in the Western Cape in particular. There were a number of municipalities where power has swapped back and forth between the ANC and the DA, sometimes with the same minority coalition partners. So if a certain coalition was unprincipled, let's say in the West Coast district municipality with the DA, what makes it more principled with the same partner once they swap sides to the ANC?
I mean, but ultimately the nature of the arrangement is never about whether or not parties agree necessarily on particular positions. Often it's really about how can we work together to take away power from a common enemy.
It can be that. In the case of the EFF, for example, as a coalition partner, or maybe more accurately as a sort of a conditional support lender in the case of the DA, because it looks more like a minority government at times in Joburg and Tshwane than a coalition government. In that case, maybe it's not so much ideological differences. Some parties have got one eye on next year's elections. They're constantly looking for feedback from their support base, whether this particular partner is palatable or not. And sometimes it comes down to the actual partners and the working style and the management style. The EFF have said that this particular DA manager, Mr. Mashaba, is more palatable than Mr. Trollip or Mr. Msimanga. So,
well, we'll talk about that in a moment, because they were saying something entirely different just a month or so ago. But also sometimes the situation of the politics of expedience, if you like. I mean, in Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, one of the things the DA has had to learn is to manage their members within their own party. I mean, they got burned by a councillor with a checkered past that until now was quite convenient for them to ignore.
That's true, and you'll remember that there was even another precedent in Mogale City, in Krugersdorp, where the coalition, there was also one of the DA and the EFF, and I think the IFP and the Freedom Front Plus, and then suddenly in a council vote, the DA-led coalition found they were one vote short, and they couldn't figure out if it was a DA or an EFF member that had swapped sides. So, yes, you've got to keep your friends and your enemies close at times.
So let's find out then, not only just in terms of keeping friends and enemies close, but also there are no permanent enemies or permanent friends. I mean, just a month ago, or several weeks at least, when Julius Malema was talking about cutting the throat of whiteness, in that very statement he mentioned Solly Msimanga as somebody they were quite prepared to work with. Several weeks later, that picture has changed.
Yes, and it's not quite clear why, and there's many theories and rumours doing the rounds. People have been linking the change of heart to the uncovering or the alleged uncovering of corruption. It's not clear, I think, to many of us outside of the tent what's going on. But yeah, it can come down to maybe the management style. The EFF has definitely complained about Athol Trollip for a long time.
But that's a difficult one as well, because if you're looking at it from Athol Trollip's point of view, for example, I mean, one of his major issues there has been fighting corruption. Now, how do you manage coalition partners against whom you have allegations or accusations within the fold? How do you do how do you deal with that and then still be able to claim to the voters that you're running a clean city?
It's difficult. There've also been stories about DA coalition partners like the IFP in Johannesburg, certain specific IFP councillors or IFP interests. There have been accusations, nothing that's yet been proven, that's been linked to the Joburg Roads Agency. So what do you do? What do you do? Because it also looks, for example, that General Holomisa is not always 100% on the same page as his colleague Mr. Bobani, who's now the mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay. So another thing we don't touch on, or an assumption that I think that we make a lot of the time, is that everything from the top down, from the national structure down to every single municipality, there's one party line. And we can see it's not the case with the EFF. They're happier with the DA in Joburg, they're happier with Mr. Mashaba, not so much in other municipalities.
I mean, let's talk then about the national picture, if you like. I mean, if you've got some people who've done some research into this, and they're saying there's no party that's going to have the kind of dominance that we've seen from the ANC since the beginning of democracy. And looking ahead, if there's going to be any unseating of the governing party nationally, it's going to have to be done by coalitions. What has this little experiment in local government told us about how that might work?
That it's going to be messy, that it's going to be back and forth, that I think all the parties have had a year or 2 years since the 2016 elections to see what coalition governments will be like. They weren't invented in 2016, but there were a lot more, and they were in every single province except for Mpumalanga, I think.
But perhaps what's changed, if I may come in there, Paul, is let's go back to Nelson Mandela Bay once again. You've got the EFF, they're sitting at around 5% of the vote. They're seemingly calling the shots. And the new mayor comes from the party that got 2% of the vote. Now, in terms of delegitimizing the process, I mean, won't voters at some point feel cheated when they're governed by people they didn't give a mandate?
It's quite possible, Bongani. And I think one of the general trends that we might see, and we'll still have to see with future by-elections and next year's elections, is whether there's going to be a growth in apathy and discontent, and whether there'll be more voters staying away, not just as we saw erstwhile ANC voters in 2016.
The DA has been accused of arrogance, and I want to ask you the question: where is the line between compromise and working well with your coalition partners and simply just acceding to all their requests and being told what to do?
I think it's going to shift from area to area. We've seen there were a number of compromises, for example, that Herman Mashaba made. He wanted, in the first month or two of assuming the mayor's chain, he wanted to pick it up into a number of companies. The EFF pushed back. There was compromise on the budget that was passed for the 2018-2019 financial year, where the EFF in the city of Joburg said this budget is not pro-poor, and the DA came back and said we will lower the tariff increases for poorer consumers. So there's room for compromise. But I think the very nature of our voting system, our electoral system, that it's proportional representation biased, that the bar is lowered for the entry of smaller parties, one-person shows or new entrants, makes the whole thing a bit more unstable. I don't know if that's good or bad. The alternative is a US or a UK situation where the power is disproportionate to the votes and there's a lot of inertia and things don't change for a long time. But it doesn't look, there's no signs that we're going to be approaching anything like stability. This instability looks set to continue.
The assumption, of course, when we think about coalition governments nationally is always that it's going to be a club of opposition parties against the ANC. Now we're looking at a possibility that perhaps the ANC and the EFF are starting to warm up towards each other on a number of fronts, on land, on free higher education, for example. And the point has been made repeatedly that the Red Berets were less against the ANC rather than against the former president, Jacob Zuma.
Julius Malema was on record on Radio 702, I think, on Eusebius' show a few months ago, saying that we as the EFF, speaking for the EFF, that the party and he didn't trust the DA and that they didn't like the white supremacist tendencies. I think that was his actual phrase. But as you said, it was the lesser of two evils. Now that Jacob Zuma is gone, it's not certain how much or how fast or how the EFF and the ANC will move towards each other.
But what do the voters do about all of this, these shifting positions, for example? I mean, we've seen a very clear difference between the EFF and the ANC. They were hard on corruption. They said that this was a corrupt party. That's sort of the daylight they wanted to create between themselves. And now we've seen, of course, the situation with the DA and working with them. What do voters make of the inconsistencies? Because today you're in bed with this one, tomorrow you're in bed with the next.
I think the EFF, although the message was always complex and complicated and has been, that they've been relatively consistent with the DA that this is a party that they're willing to work with under certain conditions, if their needs are met, but they're not interested in forming very close coalitions. As I said, sometimes it looks like a minority government for the DA in Joburg and Tshwane, but working with the EFF on a vote-by-vote, council-by-council basis. It will be interesting to see if the EFF continues that, let's say, in Nelson Mandela Bay with the ANC, whether there will be pushback, whether the EFF will be as vocal about the conditions that they want or the concessions that they want going forward.
Solve this riddle then for me. The EFF has said that one of the reasons they wanted to remove Athol Trollip was to punish the DA for its stance on land reform, which hasn't changed since 2016 when they got into arrangements with that very DA.
It's a good point. And the EFF has said that the differentiation is that DA leaders like Athol Trollip and Solly Msimanga are serving on the national executive of the party also, so that when they're punishing them maybe for wearing that extra hat, for being part of the national committee that decides on the DA's national platforms, whereas Herman Mashaba is only wearing the mayoral hat and the mayoral chain.
So if we then look at the DA itself and how perhaps it has not necessarily read the change, I mean, the ANC was calling for this. Panyaza Lesufi said, let's have a snap election, let's have a fresh mandate from the voters. If everything that they are saying is true in terms of how they've been managing these metros since 2016, why not put it to the voters?
Sorry, Bongani, are you asking why wouldn't all the major parties agree to a snap
What I'm saying is the DA has a message that, look, since 2016, we're running better cities. We now have surpluses, for example, where we found deficits. If all of that is true, why don't they do what the ANC is calling for example, in Tshwane, and say, give us a fresh mandate?
My guess, if I can be honest with you, because I'm not a politician, is that since the ouster of President Zuma and the election of President Ramaphosa at the electoral conference, that the DA is not so sure of themselves of the support they would get. Remember, in Tshwane in particular, part of the reason the DA did so well and no party got an outright majority is because ANC voters stayed away, not because DA support grew by that much. If DA support in Mamelodi or Hammanskraal grew ward by ward by 150 or 200 votes, ANC support dropped by 100, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 votes. So the DA might be afraid that those votes will come back to the ANC with a change in national leadership. And I don't think any of the parties are quite as sure of themselves as they'd like to present on TV in these press conferences.
All right, so my final question then to you would be that, of course, around the world we've seen in democracies these kinds of arrangements, whether minority governments or strong coalitions and that sort of thing. It does seem to be the pattern of most democratic countries. In a future South Africa, maybe not so much in 2019, maybe 2024, for example, what might a coalition arrangement look like nationally?
Assuming that there would be a coalition arrangement, Bongani, and that no party gets over 50%, there's certain coalitions which seem strong, if not particularly effective. An opposition coalition might contain the DA, the COPE, the ACDP. They've always worked well together for more than 5 years. Possibly the IFP, because the DA and the IFP, despite the current problems, they've worked together in northern KZN municipalities. Possibly, depending on which week it is, the Patriotic Alliance, maybe the EFF, depending on, I think, come to that point in 1 or 6 or 11 years, however long it takes us to have no clear winner, and the relative parties will assess their strengths and weaknesses, but they might still, because of our proportional representation system, I think it has a lot to do with what happens behind the scenes with the parties and politicians and how they can find each other rather than deciding on the day who they're going to work with.
And of course we know that even a week in politics is a long time. Paul Berkowitz, thank you very much for your perspective. Of course we've been asking you to participate in the conversation. Hashtag Full View on Twitter. We're asking you the question, do you think coalition governments are working in South Africa? Let's listen now to some of the comments that you've been sending via voice notes.
I think the coalition cannot work in South Africa, especially between EFF and the DA, because those parties are two different based ideology. They can't work together. The one is against the white, and the one is full with white. So that issue, I don't think coalition can work. Maybe it can work if the EFF with the UDM or ANC, but EFF and the DA, no, that's a timing bomb.
Coalition are not working because there'll always be a party that will want to be on top and the other will always want to also rule. So there will not be a cooperation in that. There'll always be a fight. Either be EFF working with the DA or EFF working in the ANC, that still won't work.